Continuing Cicero from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. For Cicero, it seems, not only wanted courage in arms, but in his speaking also, began with timidity, and in many cases scarcely left off trembling and shaking when he had got thoroughly into the current and the substance of his speech, being to defend Licinius Murena against the prosecution of Cato, and being eager to outdo Hortensius, who had made his plea with great applause. He took so little rest at night, and was so disordered with thought and overwatching, that he spoke much worse than usual. And so now, on quitting his litter to commence the cause of Milo, at the sight of Pompey, posted, as it were, and encamped with his troops above, and seeing arms shining round about the forum, he was so confounded that he could hardly begin his speech for the trembling of his body and hesitance of his tongue, whereas Milo, meantime, was bold and intrepid in his demeanor, disdaining either to let his hair grow or put on the mourning habit. And this, indeed, seems to have been one principal cause of his condemnation. Cicero, however, was thought not so much to have shown timidity for himself as anxious about his friend. He was made one of the priests whom the Romans call augurs, in the room of Crassus the Younger, dead in Parthia, and then he was appointed by lot to the province of Cilicia, and set sail thither with 12,000 foot and 2,600 horse. He had orders to bring back Cappadocia to its allegiance with Ariobarzanes, its king, which settlement he effected very completely without recourse to arms, and perceiving the Cilicians, by the great loss the Romans had suffered in Parthia, and the commotions in Syria, to have been disposed to attempt a revolt by a gentle course of government, he soothed them back into fidelity. He would accept none of the presents that were offered him by the kings. He remitted the charge of public entertainments, but daily at his own house received the ingenious and accomplished persons of the province, not sumptuously, but liberally. His house had no porter, nor was he ever found in bed by any man, but early in the morning, standing or walking before his door, he received those who came to offer their salutations. He is said never once to have ordered any of those under his command to be beaten with rods, or to have their garments rent, because perhaps he had them trained to the point where it never got to that point. You could talk to people, you could do something else, right? He never gave contumelious language in his anger, nor inflicted punishment with reproach. He detected an embezzlement to a large amount in the public money, and thus relieved the cities from their burdens at the same time that he allowed those who made restitution to remain without further punishment. Their rights as citizens he engaged too in war, so far as to give a defeat to the banditti who infested Mount Amanus, for which he was saluted by his army, Imperator, to Cacilius, the orator, who asked him to send some panthers from Cilicia to be exhibited. On the theater at Rome. He wrote in commendation of his own actions There were no panthers in Cilicia, for they were all fled to Caria in anger, that in so general a peace they had become the sole objects of attack. Well, some of these animals are actually necessary towards that they're all part of the environment. So people think if they chase off the wolves and stuff, things are going to get better. It's like, no, it's part of things getting worse for. On leaving his province, he touched at Rhodes and tarried for some length at the time of Athens, longing much to renew his old studies. He visited the eminent men of learning, and saw his former friends and companions, and after receiving in Greece the honors that were due to him, returned to the city, where everything was now, just as it were, in a flame breaking out into a civil war. When the Senate would have decreed him a triumph, he told them he had rather, so differences were accommodated, follow the triumphal chariot of Cicero. In private he gave advice to both, writing many letters to Cicero, and personally entreating Pompey, doing his best to soothe and bring to reason both the one and the other. But when matters became incurable, and Cicero was approaching Rome, and Pompey durst not abide it, but with many honest citizens left the city, Cicero, as did yet not join in the flight, and was reputed to adhere to Cicero, and it is very evident he was in his thoughts much divided, and wavered painfully between both, for he writes in his epistles, to which side I should turn. Pompey has the fair and honorable plea for war, and Cicero, on the other hand, has managed his affairs better, and is more able to secure himself and his friends. So that I know whom I should fly, not whom I should fly to. But when Trebatius, one of Cicero's friends, by letter signified to him that Cicero thought it was his most desirable course to join his party and partake his hopes, but if he considered himself too old a man for this, then he should retire into Greece and stay quietly there, out of the way of either party. Cicero, wondering that Cicero had not written himself, gave an angry reply, that he should not do anything unbecoming in his past life. Such is the account to be collected from his letters. But as soon as Cicero was marched into Spain, he immediately sailed away to join Pompey, and he was welcomed by all but Cato, who, taking him privately, chid him for coming to Pompey. As for himself, he said it had been indecent to forsake that party and the commonwealth which he had chosen from the beginning, but Cicero might have been more useful to his country and friends. If remaining neuter, he had attended and used his influence to moderate the result, instead of coming hither to make himself, without reason or necessity, an enemy to Cicero, and a partner in such great dangers. By this language, partly Cicero's feelings were altered, and partly also because Pompey made no great use of him, although indeed he was himself the cause of it, by his not denying he was sorry he had come, by his depreciating Pompey's resources, finding fault underhand with his counsels, and continually indulging in jests and sarcastic remarks on his fellow soldiers, though he went about in the camp with a gloomy and melancholy face himself, he was always trying to raise a laugh in others, whether they wished it or not. It may not be amiss to mention a few instances to Domitius on his preferring to a command one who was no soldier, and saying in his defense that he was a modest and prudent person. He replied, "Why did you not keep him for a tutor for your children?" On hearing Theophanes, the lesbian, no, you mean, It's somebody from a place, not what we mean when we say lesbian. Of course, you pronounce the S. Who was master of the engineers in the army, praised for the admirable way in which he had consoled the Rhodians for the loss of their fleet. What a thing it is, he said, to have a Greek in command, when Cicero had been acting successfully and in a manner blockading Pompey. Lentulus was saying it was reported that Cicero's friends were out of heart, because, said Cicero, they do not wish Cicero well. To one Marcius, who had just come from Itola, and told them that there was a strong report at Rome that Pompey was blocked up, he said, and you sailed hither to see it with your own eyes. To Nonius, encouraging them after defeat to be of good hope, because there were 7 eagles still left in Pompey's camp. Good reason for encouragement, said Cicero, if we were going to fight with jackdaws. Labienus insisted on some prophecies to the effect that Pompey would gain the victory. Yes, said Cicero, and the first step in the campaign has been losing our camp. After the battle of Pharsalia was over, at which he was not present for want of health, and Pompey was fled, Cato, having considerable forces and a great fleet at Dyrrhachium, would have had Cicero commander-in-chief. According to law and the precedents of his consular dignity, and on his refusing the command and wholly declining to take part in their plans for continuing the war, he was in the greatest danger of being killed, young Pompey and his friends calling him a traitor and drawing their swords upon him, only that Cato interposed and hardly rescued and brought him out of the camp. Afterwards, arriving at Brundisium, he tarried there for some time in expectation of Cicero, who was delayed by his affairs in Asia and Egypt. Well, the Greek for Egypt is what? Aegyptos? I think that's how you say it. Which was, of course, not the name the locals had. It wasn't called Egypt until it was conquered. And when it was told him that he was arrived at Tarentum and was coming thence by land to Brundisium, he hastened towards him, not altogether without hope, and yet in some fear of making experiment of the tempter of an enemy and conqueror in the presence of many witnesses. But there was no necessity for him either to speak or to do anything unworthy of him, unworthy of himself, for Cicero, as soon as he saw him coming a good way before the rest of the company, came down to meet him, saluted him, and leading the way, conversed with him alone for some furlongs, and from that time forward he continued to treat him with honor and respect, so that when Cicero wrote an oration in praise of Cato, Cicero, in writing an answer to it, took occasion to commend Cicero's own life and eloquence, comparing him to Pericles and Theramenus. Cicero's oration was called Cato, Cicero's Antecacto. So also it is related when Quintus Ligarius was prosecuted for having been in arms against Cicero, and Cicero had undertaken his defense. Cicero said to his friends, "Why might we not as well once more hear a speech from Cicero? Ligarius, there is no question, is a wicked man and an enemy. But when Cicero began to speak, he wonderfully moved him, and proceeded in his speech with such varied pathos. I guess we're using it's the English term. Much varied pathos. Pathos? How do people usually say that? But in Greek, it's omicron. And such charm of language that the color of Caesar's countenance, pathos, yeah, often changed, and it was evident that all the passions of his soul were in commotion. At length, the orator touching upon the Pharsalian battle, he was so affected that his body trembled, and some of the papers he had dropped out of his hands, and thus he was overpowered and acquitted. Vigarius and the Order of Nine Angles, and some of the associated groups, or related groups, you could say. Pathos Mathai is the dialectic, you could say. Well, that's not quite but you know what I mean. Yeah, I guess that's right. But henceforth, the Commonwealth being changed into a monarchy, Cicero withdrew himself from public affairs, and employed his leisure in instructing those young men that would, in philosophy, and by the near intercourse he thus had with some of the noblest and highest in rank, he again began to possess great influence in the city. The work and object to which he set himself was to compose and translate philosophical dialogues, and to render logical and physical terms into the Roman idiom. For he it was, as it is said, who first or principally gave Latin names to fantasia, syncatathesis, syncatathesis, epocha, catalepsis, atamon, ameris, canon, and other such technical terms. Now, if you're going to intersperse Latin and Greek in the middle of things, it's important to kind of tell us what these things mean, because I actually don't know what all those things mean, which, either by metaphors or other means of accommodation, he succeeded in making intelligible and expressible to the Romans. For his recreation, he exercised his dexterity in poetry, but he was set to it would make 500 verses in a night. He spent the greatest part of his time at his country house near Tusculum. He wrote to his friends that he had led the life of Laertes, either jestingly, as his custom was, or rather from a feeling of ambition for public employment, which made him impatient under the present state of affairs. He rarely went to the city unless to pay his court to Caesar. He was commonly the first among those who voted him honors, and sought out new terms of praise for himself and for his actions, as, for example, what he said of the statues of Pompey which had been thrown down, and were afterwards by Caesar's orders set up again, that Caesar, by this act of humanity, had indeed set up Pompey's statues, but he had fixed and established his own. Well, why do you need your own statue in the temple? You could have a plaque and it'll actually carry on the same thing of legacy and stuff, right? He had a design, it is said, of writing history of his country, combining with it much of that of Greece, and incorporating in it all the stories and legends of the past that he had collected. So, not every, the Jews weren't the only people who wrote Bibles. Every other nation that wrote actually did that. Of course, we don't have any of most of those things, but we hear that it was done. But his purposes were interfered with by various public and various private unhappy occurrences and misfortunes, for most of which he was himself in fault. For first of all he put away his wife Terentia, by whom he had been neglected in time of the war, and sent away destitute of necessaries for his journey. Neither did he find her kind when he returned into Ipla, for she did not join him at Brundisium, where he stayed a long time, nor would allow her young daughter, who undertook so long a journey. Decent attendants are the requisite expenses. Besides, she left him a naked and empty house, and yet had involved him in many and great debts. These were alleged as the fairest reasons for the divorce. So even back in the day, people cared about cause when it came to divorce. But Terentia, who denied them all, had the most unmistakable defense, furnished her by her husband himself, who not long after married a young maiden for the love of her beauty, as Terentia upbraided him, or as Tiro, his emancipated slave, has written, for her riches to discharge his debts. For the young woman was very rich, and Cicero had the custody of her estate, being left guardian in trust, and being indebted many myriads of money. He was persuaded by friends and relations to marry her, notwithstanding his disparity of age, and to use her money to satisfy his creditors. Now, in principle, there's nothing. It's perfectly fine to marry somebody for their beauty and their wealth, and honestly, age differences don't prove to be the thing unless people, program themselves into things. Now, it's people's actual condition, that's different. But as a man in particular, you should try to settle your own debts, not, But if the woman wants to be charitable and help you out, that's her business. There's nothing probably good in her doing that, but because relieving people of their debts is an important thing to do in society. Antona, who mentions this marriage in his answer to the Philippics, reproaches him for putting away a wife with whom he had lived to old age. Now, see, you don't have to do that. When you marry a younger woman, you don't have to divorce the other woman. Even in America, polygamy is legal, just as long as you're not trying to collect welfare for each woman or something. And you shouldn't marry so many women that you now collect welfare. But then again, in America, the rich that's where most of the welfare goes. But you know what I mean. Adding some happy strokes of sarcasm on Cicero's domestic, inactive, unsoldier-like habits. Well, maybe he was disabled, and good for him marrying a woman with money rather than, killing himself. Like, how many people have done that in here? Well, we're not done with the chapter yet, though. So, not long after this marriage, his daughter died in childbed at Antyllus' house, to whom he had been married after the death of Piso, her former husband. The philosophers from all parts came to comfort Cicero, for his grief was so excessive that he put away his new married wife, because she seemed to be pleased at the death of Tullia. And thus stood Cicero's domestic affairs at this time. He had no concern in the design that was now forming against Caesar, although in general he was Brutus's most principal confidant, and one who was aggrieved at the present, and as desirous of the former state of public affairs as any other whatsoever. but they feared his temper, as wanting courage, and his old age, in which the most daring dispositions are apt to be timorous. As soon, therefore, as the act was committed by Brutus and Cassius, and the friends of Caesar were got together, so that there was fear in the city, would again be involved in a civil war. Antenna, being consul, convened the Senate and made a short address, recommending concord, and Cicero following, with various remarks, such as the occasion called for, persuaded the Senate to imitate the Athenians, and decree an amnesty for what had been done in Caesar's case, and to bestow provinces on Brutus and Cassius. But neither of these things took effect, for as soon as the common people of themselves, inclined to pity, saw the dead body of Caesar borne through the marketplace, and Antenna, showing his clothes filled with blood, and pierced through in every part with swords, enraged to a degree of frenzy, they made a search for the murderers, and with firebrands in their hands, ran to their houses to burn them. They, however, being forewarned, avoided this danger, and expecting many more and greater to come, they left the city. Of course, Caesar is the, Sar, not Z. There's no Zer. And C, but in Greek it would be Kaisar. But whether you're trying to incense people or whether it's a triumph thing or whatever, cover the body, maybe wash it first or something, but well, nowadays, we put makeup on it instead. It's like makeup and prosthetics on a dead body, Anyways, they were being forewarned of avoiding this danger, expecting many more greater to come. They left the city. Antenna, on this, was at once in exultation, and every one was in alarm with the prospect that he would make himself sole ruler, and Cicero in more alarm than any one, for Antenna, seeing his influence reviving in the Commonwealth, and knowing how closely he was connected with Brutus, was ill-pleased to have him in the city. Now, there's issues with disease, there's issues with the consciousness, too, if the people who repress the idea of death, but you don't have to be grotesque about it. You can, one's shrouded, it's a solemn thing, and people know what's going on. Just like an animal, you might wrap an animal in a sheet or something as you carry it off to be buried or something. Besides, there had been some former jealousy between them, occasioned by the difference of their manners. Cicero, fearing the event, was inclined to go as lieutenant with Dolabella at Assyria, but Hirtius and Pansa, consuls elect as successors of Antony, good men and lovers of Cicero, entreated him not to leave them, undertaking to put down Antenna, if he would stay in Rome, and he, neither distrusting wholly nor trusting them, let Dolabella go without him, promising Hirtius that he would go and spend his summer at Athens, and return again when he entered upon his office. So he set out on his journey, but some delay occurring in his passage, new intelligence, as often happens, came suddenly from Rome, that Antenna had made an astonishing change, and was doing all things and managing all public affairs at the will of the Senate, and that there wanted nothing but his presence to bring things to a happy settlement, and therefore, blaming himself for his cowardice, he returned again to Rome, and was not deceived in his hopes at the beginning, for such multitudes flocked out to meet him, that the compliments and civilities which were paid him at the gates, and at his entrance into the city took up almost one whole day's time. On the morrow Antenna convened the Senate, and summoned Cicero thither. He came not, but kept his bed, pretending to be ill with his journey, but the true reason seemed the fear of some design against him, upon a suspicion and intimation given him on his way to Rome. Antenna, however, showed great offense at the affront, and sent soldiers, commanding them to bring him or burn his house. But many interceding and supplicating for him, he was contented to accept sureties. Ever after, when they met, they passed one another with silence, and continued on their guard, till Cicero the younger, coming from Apollonia, entered on the first Cicero's inheritance, and was engaged in a dispute with Antenna about 2,500 myriads of money, which Antenna detained from the estate. Upon this, Philippus, who married the mother, and Marcellus, who married the sister of young Cicero, came with the young man to Cicero, and agreed with him that Cicero should give them the aid of his eloquence and political influence with the Senate and the people. Cicero gave Cicero the defense of his riches and arms, for the young man had already a great party of the soldiers of Cicero about him, and Cicero's readiness to join him was founded, it is said, on some yet stronger motives, for it seems, while Pompey and Cicero were yet alive, Cicero, in his sleep, had fancied himself engaging in calling some of the sons of the senators into the Capitol. Jupiter, being about, according to the dream, they mean the spirit of Jupiter, to declare one of them the chief ruler of Rome. The citizens, running up with curiosity, stood about the temple, and the youths, sitting in their purple bordered robes, kept silence. On a sudden the doors opened, and the youths, arising one by one in order, passed round the entity, who reviewed them all, and to their sorrow dismissed them. But when this one was passing by, the entity stretched forth his right hand and said, O ye Romans, this young man, when he shall be the Lord of Rome, shall put an end to all your civil wars. It is said that Cicero formed from his dream a distinct image of the youth, and retained it afterwards perfectly, but did not know who it was. The next day, going down into the Campus Martius, he met the boys returning from their gymnastic exercises, and the first was he, just as he appeared to him in his dream. Now, sometimes entities do pass on the image of people, right? Being astonished at it, he asked him who were his parents, and it proved to be this young Cicero, whose father was a man of no great eminence, Octavius, and his mother Atia, Cicero's sister's daughter, for which reason Cicero, who had no children, made him by will the heir of his house and property. From that time it is said that Cicero studiously noticed the youth whenever he met him, and was keenly received with civility, and by fortune happened to be born when Cicero was consul. And so why would the Jinn of Jupiter have done this? We'll find out next, right?